Welcome to Building Bridges, Strengthening Refugee Communities Through Education. My name is Merlene Tucker, and I'll be running this Dialogue for Health web forum alongside my colleague, Jeff Bornstein. Thank you to our partner for today's event, the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health at the Public Health Institute. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator of today's event, Sarah Lackey. Sarah is the Advisory Group Associate at the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health at the Public Health Institute. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Good morning, everyone. As Marlene said, my name is Sarah Lackey, and I'm the Advisory Group Associate at the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health, which is a center of the Public Health Institute. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I'm so excited that you all have joined us today, and I hope you enjoy our presentations. Thank you. Throughout this 90-minute webinar, we're going to be discussing some of the numerous challenges confronted by refugees, with a special focus on Afghan and Ukrainian refugee students in California. By the end of the webinar, our hope is that you leave with a stronger understanding of World Refugee Day, the challenges faced by refugees, and actionable steps that can be taken to support and uplift refugees throughout the state and the country. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Throughout this webinar, you'll hear from 5 different presenters who will share their experiences, expertise, and guidance, ranging from lived experience as a refugee to medical expertise. We'll finish with a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session where you can ask presenters specific questions that are not answered during the presentation. All right, and then if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to now introduce our first presenter, Dr. Sadiq Khadratsai, the Executive Director of the Center of Immigrant and Refugee Health, who will give some opening remarks about World Refugee Day.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning and good afternoon for those of you joining us from the East Coast. It's an honor to be on this call today and to highlight the importance of the World Refugee Day. It's a day to recognize the strength, courage, and resilience of the millions of refugees around the world. And obviously, the World Refugee Day is an opportunity to spotlight the plight of millions who are displaced because of no fault of their own, but because of the conflict, persecution, and violence that these populations could no longer tolerate. Therefore, it's not a refugee crisis enough in itself, but the political crisis, wars, and violence that lead to mass displacement. And today is also about the compassion, humanity, and the solidarity of the receiving communities, from the government employees to the settlement agencies, teachers, and most importantly, our neighbors, communities, and everyday Americans. The United States is one of the most welcoming nations. Since the passage of the Refugee Act in 1980, the United States has admitted more than 3.2 million refugees. Since refugees come from almost 200 countries, depending on each group or country of origin, an estimated 40 to 50% of the refugees are children. And refugee children are more vulnerable to the adversities and adverse experiences associated with displacement. As you know, the brain is susceptible to the experiences around us in all age groups. But the younger we are, the more susceptible the brain. That's why we learn swimming, soccer, art, or music more easily when we are young. And so is the impact of negative experiences, as some of them might have lifetime consequences. Therefore, you will hear again and again today from our speakers about the vulnerability of school-age refugees and refugee children, and the important role that the schools can play, not only in the academic success, but also in the overall health, well-being, and integration. We often consider schools as safety islands for refugee children because these young refugees might be alien to the community and go home where their parents might be struggling with adjustment of their own. For the refugee children, education represents a bridge to stability, opportunity, and hope. School is a sanctuary where refugee children can regain a sense of normalcy, play, make new friends, learn new skills, and dream of a brighter future despite the hardships they have endured. At the PHI Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health, together with our partners and community, our mission is grounded in a holistic approach, ensuring refugees, regardless of their country of origin, have a better health, well-being, successful integration, and also respecting their culture, dignity, language, and everything that they bring to our community. I would like to acknowledge and thank our partners, especially California Department of Social Services, Office of Immigrant Youth, which is supporting much of the school programs in the state of California, which Jasmine will talk about in a little bit, and also CDPH, Office of Refugee Health. I also appreciate all of you joining us today and our speakers and the PHI team for organizing this event. So let us stand in solidarity with refugees today and every day. And with that, I will hand it over back to Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiq. And if you could have us go to the next slide, please. I really appreciate your opening remarks to kick off this webinar. And I'm excited to introduce our next speaker. So if you could go to the next slide. Our next speaker is Yahya Nassimi, who is a student in Oakland, California. He's originally from Kabul, Afghanistan. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Yahya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yahya Nassimi. I'm a 12th grader in the Bay Area, and I'm from Kabul, Afghanistan. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to talk about being an Afghan refugee in American schools. Next slide, please. I arrived in the United States in 2021, right before the fall of Kabul. I came with my whole family. I come with 2 of my brothers, 3 of my sisters, and my parents. My life in Afghanistan was pretty good, despite the safety concerns that we always had. I lived in a big house close to my family members and cousins. We knew everyone who lived in our neighborhood. My dad was working for US Embassy, and we lived a comfortable life because he was making good money. But he was constantly worried about threats because he was working with the American government. So he would check his car every time he got in to make sure there weren't any explosive devices attached to his car. And because the Taliban was targeting people who worked with the US Embassy, bomb threats, drive-by shootings, and kidnapping were pretty common, even though we lived in Kabul and had a good life. Eventually, my dad heard the Taliban were going to take over Kabul. At the time, there were many Afghans who were helping the US Army as translators and guides. But when the US left Afghanistan, the Afghan people who were supporting them had to figure out how to keep themselves safe. Before we left, there were a lot of kidnappings happening, so we didn't tell anyone that we were leaving. After that, we got our visas and medical checks. We were trying to get tickets to a nonprofit that was helping people leave, but they never responded to us, and my dad ended up having to pay for tickets. After that, we went to Dubai, and then we arrived in San Francisco. Next slide, please. Arriving in US, coming to the US felt horrible because we were on a plane for 16 hours. And the first day and the first few months of being here, it felt like we had to adapt to a new city and a new life. And I didn't speak any English. And I remember when I would go to the store, I would pray that the person working there wouldn't ask me any questions. And on the first day of school, I remember feeling scared. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to communicate with anyone. So I would just sit in class and not say anything at all. I thought that the American schools were be like what we had seen in movies, like everyone helping each other and being friendly. But it wasn't really like that. I was alone with my brother in my classes, and we would just sit there and look at each other. We didn't know how to log in or use our email or anything like that. But after that, I started watching movies with subtitles in English, and I used an app to learn. And within 3 months, I became fluent. And next slide, please. So the school differences in Afghanistan, I went to a private school, and all of my friends and teachers were in the same school from the first grade, and everyone knew each other and helped each other. And my last year, I was taking about 12 classes, including biology, chemistry, government, economics, Quran classes, Arabic, Pashto, computer classes, and English. Our teachers were really strict. We couldn't bring our phones to school. If we talked back to our teachers or tried to leave class early, we could get hit with a piece of wood or cable. The public schools were pretty different from my private school. From my private school though, because they didn't have as many resources for books, chairs, desks, and other school supplies. And the schools here are really different from a school in Afghanistan because the people who work at school are much nicer. It's not as strict. You can choose your classes. There's counselors and free bus passes and lunch. So it was a really different experience for us when we first came here. Next slide, please. I think that some of the challenges for Afghan students when they come to the US is that there isn't many people who speak Dari or Pashto to help students with enrollment. And enrollment was really hard because we had to fill out so many forms, get our immunization records and transcripts. That was just a new process for us because when you enroll in school in Afghanistan, you just do it one time and you don't have to do it every year. And another challenge is that many Afghan parents don't know how to use the internet or emails. So even if the school sets up an email account for them, they don't know how to use it. And another challenge is that a lot of subjects we learn in school are new for us, like American history or health education classes. And a lot of Afghan students feel alone because it feels like no one else understands what we're going through. And it's just like a whole challenge for Afghan students. Next slide, please. Even though starting school here was difficult at first, over time I became more comfortable with the school stuff and I started making friends at school. There was also a program that started coming to our school that was for Middle Eastern students to get support. And they were people who knew about our culture and spoke Dari and Pashto, and we would see them every week and we would have different events and they would help us with our homework and other stuff. And there was also a wellness center at school where we could go to when we weren't feeling good to just have a cup of tea and sit down between classes. And throughout my freshman year, I became a wellness ambassador, which was a program at our school where they picked a student from each country and the ambassador will help other students from their country with translating, tutoring, and if they needed help with anything, the ambassador would support them. Also, our school had us pick an adult buddy that we could go talk to about anything, and my buddy helped me a lot. And next slide, please. I want to take this opportunity to tell you that even though we as Afghans have been through a lot, we're very resilient people who care about our education and building new future here. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope you learned a little more about Afghan students.
Thank you so much, Yahya, for your vulnerability and sharing your personal experiences. Really appreciate you sharing. See a lot of positive reactions from the attendees as well. If you could go to the next slide, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Daria Zolotowska. Daria recently graduated from Santa Monica High School and will soon be a freshman at Santa Monica College, and she is originally from Eastern Ukraine. All right, Daria, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daria Zolotowska, and I'm a refugee from Ukraine. And today I would like to share with you my story. Next slide, please. I moved to the United States 2 years ago from a small city, Kharkiv, in the Donetsk Oblast. Moving to the absolutely new country was a forced decision made by my family in a hurry after 3 months of Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine. Despite the fact that the war between Russia and Ukraine began back in 2014, the wave of new war in our country was an enormous shock and a horrifying time for millions of people. My personal journey began in April 2022 when my parents made a decision to apply for a special program allowing Ukrainian refugees to temporarily enter the United States. When in a month my family got an approval, we had exactly 10 days to get ready, diving into a completely new world where another culture, language, people, and traditions were new and undiscovered yet. Even though I'd been inspired by the idea of moving to another city or country since my middle school, those dreams were only my far future goals. But when my parents declared their decisions, I was shocked but very inspired. Next slide, please. First challenges that we were faced with began in the airport. It is important to note that my parents didn't speak English, and even now it still remains one of the biggest problems in our immigration. My language skills were fortunately better, but it still wasn't enough to freely communicate with people. As soon as we crossed the border, I became my family personal translator, which up to this day I still am. I vividly recall trying to explain about our visas to US officers, and now I realized that that was only the beginning of my communication with government officials. Next slide, please. Summer 2022 was the most challenging and depressive time in my life. Next slide, please. For the first 3 months, me and my parents were sharing one small room in my aunt's house. My parents started working 1 week after arrival into US, and basically for the entire summer, I was staying all alone in that room. I never had a chance to meet new people or find friends. I was looking forward for the beginning of the new school year because I had a lot of hope that that's going to be my only chance to begin communicating with people and at least find someone who can help me to deal with my loneliness. Getting closer to the beginning of school, my parents started looking for a separate apartment, but because we didn't have enough documents or a high credit score, it was almost an impossible task to find a nice place to stay. Stress and fear were the most common emotions of that time. Next slide, please. In August 2022, I was enrolled in Santa Monica High School, and as a junior, I finally began to explore a new culture from its inside. Everything was completely different. New educational system, new people around, teachers, classes, and language, of course. The first challenge that I faced within school was still my language barrier. At the very beginning, I wasn't able to understand anything that people around me were saying. I was only able to catch the fragments of phrases, and depending on person's emotions, guess what they're talking about. During the first semester, it was very difficult to cope with the rules of new education system because no one really explained the particular details, and it felt like everyone around me already knew everything, and I was the only exception in that system. I feel that intensive studying was my only way to escape the reality where I was left all alone with myself for a long period of time. And since my parents and my brother lived in a very small apartment, it was really hard to concentrate on my classes. Everything around was pressing, and I was continuously thinking about getting back home where I was free of all my painful concerns. The sense of not belonging and the feeling of loneliness followed me nearly for the entire school year. It was challenging for me to find a common interest and make new friends in school who shared the similar experiences and cultural backgrounds, despite the fact that I'm a quite extroverted person. Next slide, please. But what helped me to stay on my toes and do not give up was the support from my family and finding new friends. Only working on myself and the belief that I can become the best version of myself helped me to achieve some success in a completely new environment. I would advise all newly arrived people to do not give up and do not give in to the desire to come back to your usual comfort during the most difficult periods of immigration, because in the future, it will be all worth it. Newcomers are looking for support. Newcomers are looking for a person who they trust and can freely ask anytime they have questions, because there will be a bunch of misunderstandings. Besides that, that is a really nice idea to have a book or a page on a school website where all details would be easily explained for students in their own language. Unfortunately, the web translator does not give the exact translation, and sometimes important moments might be mistakenly understood. However, when native speakers freely explain it to new students, it will be much easier for them to understand all those important issues. By the way, with a group of other foreign students, we created a guide for future international newcomers, in which in detail we described all necessary concerns and resources that are important to know before getting into an American school. And we translated in several languages. Next slide, please. In a conclusion, it is important to highlight that all newcoming refugee students are looking for support and especially the assistance in dealing with their emotions and feelings. Finding friends and peers who share your culture background is a key in that journey. And thank you much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daria. There's a lot of excitement and love being shared in the reactions right now. I really appreciate you sharing about your journey to the United States, and I can see everyone else does as well. And if you could go to the next slide, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Zareen Noor. Dr. Noor is a pediatrician at UCSF Vinod Children's Hospital in Oakland. She's a director of International Clinic at the Primary Care and co-director of the Center of Excellence for Immigrant Child Health and Wellbeing. And she's the Associate Program Director of Children's Hospital Oakland Pediatric Residency Program. Welcome, Dr. Noor.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for having me today, and really want to thank Daria and Yaya for sharing their story and their journey. I think it's such a great foundation for the talk I'm going to give, and so it's really, and I just wanted to say that as Daria and Yaya were talking about it, it just reminded my own migration here as a refugee, and you know, decades later, the same kind of issues are still kind of affects refugee youth who are kind of resettling here in the U.S. And I really commend the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health, and as well as the PHI for putting on a talk like this to really kind of hopefully, you know, avoid some of those challenges and barriers that refugee students deal with. And I think as a group, I think there's a diverse group of people here on this panel, and then also attending this webinar to kind of address these issues. So that's a little intro. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, I'll be talking a little bit about some medical conditions and how trauma really affects learning for new immigrants and refugees, and how we can provide some support. Next slide. We'll talk about trauma and how that affects cognitive emotional regulation. We'll talk a little bit about educational challenges that are faced by refugees, and then identify various medical conditions. This is not going to be comprehensive, but just a little bit of an introduction to some of those medical conditions that might impact learning, and then recognize how just coming into a new environment can be challenging. Next slide. As we all know, and I think you guys all had a webinar prior to this one around trauma, and so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but just wanted to let you know that there are a lot of trauma that refugees face during their journey, and it doesn't always end when they enter their new community. So it can, you know, they often are exposed to a lot of trauma prior to their migration. During their migration can be very traumatic, depending on their journey out of their home country and into their host country. And then post-migration, once they are resettled into a new community, there can be a lot of trauma that they still face. Next slide. I like this kind of buckets of type of stress that refugees may face. And so again, there can be a lot of overlap. These might not all be in their separate buckets, but these stresses can overlap. But just recognizing that there are a lot of stressors that refugees face. Again, things that they may have experienced in their home country during their journey, and then also here in for us here in the U.S. or Canada region. So thinking about kind of all of these stresses that they may experience. Next slide. So why do we want to know about these stresses? Why is it important? We know that that the health of children can be affected when there's a lot of stress or prolonged stress that they're experiencing, and if they're not having buffering relationships and things that help build those resiliences to prevent those stresses affecting them. Next slide. I think some folks might know this term ACEs, which is called adverse childhood experiences. These are things that children may have been exposed to that can result in toxic stress. When these stresses are prolonged, they can have lasting effects on growing bodies, and they can affect their overall health. And we also know that some of these toxic stresses can also really prevent children from learning, but also affect their learning as well. And so learning about these stresses and how do we kind of prevent those health consequences is important. And so there are some great handouts in other languages around ACEs, which can be a good way to talk to families about, how do we build up those resiliency factors? How do we create those buffering factors that prevent these like kind of prolonged stresses on affecting a growing body. So you can look up these wonderful ACEs websites. All right, next slide, please. All right, so what does that look like in a child? So I'm a pediatrician, so this is, how do we see how stress manifests in children. It's different than adults, right? So children will manifest their trauma and their stresses in a different way than we do as adults. And it might be different depending on their age. And so we see for the younger preschool age kids, they might have things like separation anxiety. They might not be very clingy to the parent and not want to let them go. They may be very fearful. They can have things like bedwetting, or they might have been, totally potty trained and then they regress and they're having more accidents. They might have nightmares. They might be engaging in very traumatic play where they're like, either drawing it out or playing it out, these kind of violent things that they have experienced or have been exposed to. As they get older in the elementary school, they might still have some of those issues, but might now have a little bit more of kind of more sleep issues. They might have somatic complaints. They might say like, my stomach hurts all the time, right? Have headaches all the time. And there's no real medical condition for them, but it's the stresses that they're experiencing. They might be acting out, being very aggressive. For the middle school and high school, this is right, a hard time for them. They're becoming teenagers. They might be having other things. They might be engaging in kind of risky behaviors or having self-destructive behaviors as kind of a manifestation of the trauma that they've experienced. Next slide, please. So why does this all matter, right? Because if they're stressed out, if they're having all this trauma, it's hard to learn. It's hard to be engaged as a student in the classroom. If they're dealing with all of this trauma and this toxic stress, it can affect their learning. And so we know that, their impacts on learning can be everything from cognitive effect. They might have a hard time paying attention, retaining the information that they're learning. They might have behavioral problems in classroom, right? They might not be able to sit still. They might not be able to, have good relationships with their peers. They might have social effects, right? They might be tired. They might be withdrawing, right? They might not just be engaging in the classroom. And then we see, as a result of all that, they might have lower achievement. They might not want to go to school. They might have excuses. My stomach hurts today, mommy. I don't want to go to school. I have a headache, right? School avoidance. So that's definitely going to affect their academic performance. And then the long term, right? All of this adds up. If they're missing school, if they're not doing well, they're not able to keep up with their peers, they're going to be held back. They might be so, when they're in teenagers, they might just be like, I'm done. I don't want to go to school anymore. And they might drop out. So these can have snowballing effects if it's not dealt with. Next. Some of the kind of conditions that may overlap and may be complicated for refugee students are things like mental health conditions, like anxiety. We know that anxiety can affect academic performance for teens and for children. This might be even heightened. That anxiety might be even heightened due to perhaps the trauma that they've experienced and adjusting to a new environment and a new culture, a new language, not knowing the language, not knowing, the social kind of cues and things that they need to understand in a social environment that might build up on their anxiety and add to it. Same with depression, right? They might, that whole separation, maybe they are separated from a caregiver or they don't have their support here in the US, that might affect their depression, make them even more depressed. And then post-traumatic stress disorder, some of them are coming in with that, right? They might have experienced very traumatic events prior to their migration, and now it's really affecting them, and they're having flashbacks or they're having uncontrollable thoughts around it. Next slide. This one, I think it's important to kind of recognize, I think for folks who are in the school and kind of working with students, there's a lot of overlap sometimes we see with what is considered attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a medical diagnosis that results in kind of difficulty sustaining attention, being very hyperactive, impulsive, and this impacts their concentration and academic performance. And we often see, even outside of the refugee population, with kids who have experienced a lot of trauma, we see a lot of overlap in kind of the symptoms of ADHD, the signs and symptoms of ADHD, and the signs and symptoms of trauma. Right. If you think about trauma, kids who have experienced a lot of trauma in their life, and what I talked about earlier about what does that look like in a child? It can be, right, that not feeling a lot of fear, feeling irritable, being aggressive, not being able to sit still, kind of a lot of those things are symptoms of trauma. And so when you have ADHD, if you have a child who may have ADHD and have trauma, right, there's a lot of overlap, and some of that is difficult to tease out. Is it truly ADHD? Is it trauma, or is it both? Right? And there might be some overlapping issues. So it's a complicated thing to kind of, discuss in this very short time, but just something to think about, right? That sometimes the symptoms of trauma can be manifesting in other ways, and it might somebody might be might have ADHD, and it's hard to tease out which is what. All right, next slide. All right. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that these learning challenges, that learning disabilities that children might have, might be overlooked and or exacerbated for refugee children who are kind of starting school here in the US. So things like dyslexia and having issues with reading and language processing, that can be compounded when you're learning a new language, right? And it might be missed because they are like, oh, they just don't know English, and so that's why they're having a hard time reading, whereas they actually truly have a learning difficulty, a learning challenge, like dyslexia or dyscalculia, right? Or dysgraphia, writing ability, if they're having some issues with that. So these learning challenges can be often misdiagnosed, or just or delayed diagnosis, or it might be exacerbated and cause more kind of academic problems if it's not identified that they have these issues and get the support that they need. Next slide, please. Autism is it's a disorder that affects communication, social skills, and behavior. And this also is one of those where can be missed if if we are not looking for it or we're not paying attention. Again, being like, oh well, they're learning a new language and they're not speaking, is because it's a new environment, it's a new language, or they've experienced a lot of trauma and this is why they're not engaging with their peers. So again, making sure we're thinking about it, taking each individual child and thinking about it, and making sure that if they are exhibiting signs of autism spectrum disorder, that they get the evaluation and services. We know that early intervention, like getting kids with autism support early on, can make a huge difference. There are some great, CDC has a wonderful website called Learn the Signs, Act Early, and they have a whole website full of great information on developmental stages and what is expected at each age. And I highly recommend, and there's a lot of handouts in different languages on developmental milestones. And so if depending on what refugee population you're working with, there's some great handouts in their native language that can be very helpful for families to know what's expected for each child based on their age and their development. So I highly recommend taking a look at that when you get a chance. Next slide, please. The other thing to kind of think about and make sure we're paying attention to and not missing is any kind of hearing or vision impairments. And so there are, they might not have had a hearing exam. Here in the US, we do hearing evaluations on all newborns when they're born to try to catch, kind of any hearing loss. And so they might not have had any hearing evaluation. So making sure we are not missing things like a hearing loss or visual loss as well. Next slide, please. And that goes into speech language delay as well. Oftentimes we're like, oh well, they're exposed to multiple languages at home, so that's why they're not talking, or they're having a hard time. But it's we know that that's actually not true. There are milestones. There are things that they should be developing based on their age. And again, this is what I was talking about earlier, the CDC's website. They have a wonderful checklist in different languages, which is super helpful for families to review. All right, next slide, please. There are other medical conditions that you can work with your pediatrician or a medical provider to make sure that the child is screened for, to make sure that that's not affecting their learning. So things like lead exposure can affect our can cause cognitive impairment. And so making sure that their lead level is evaluated. Anemia, so a low hemoglobin, can also affect concentration, cause fatigue. And then there are a lot of other chronic conditions. So, making sure that they get a good checkup with their pediatrician to make sure there's no other kind of chronic condition. And those things can cause academic performance issues as well. Next slide, please. All right, so what are the roles for schools in resettlement? So I think schools are super important. They provide a safe environment. This is a place where kids will spend hours of their days there, and so it's really and it plays a very important role. So ensure that create a welcoming, inclusive atmosphere for them. You know, this is what you guys do really well as schools do, is they offer ESL and English support for them, and they function as a cultural bridge. They really help build those social networks and help families feel more integrated into the community, and it helps students adapt to their new environment while maintaining their cultural identity. So it's super important. Next slide, please. I think it's important for them to also think about the special education services, like really, what I mentioned earlier, making sure we're not overlooking learning disabilities and learning difficulties, and making sure that they get evaluated. I know sometimes schools districts are very limited in their funding, and it's hard to get children, especially if they don't speak English, evaluated. But I think it's really important to get that, get those kids, if appropriate, and expedite, or just appropriate evaluation. Again, working with them to make sure they have individualized learning plans if they needed, or accommodations like a 504 plan. So things like that are super important, and important to work with families to understand what services are available to them, and their rights as students for certain services. And then, focusing on the educators, making sure that they are trained in trauma-informed approaches to make sure that the students that they're working with, who might come in with a lot of trauma, that they are recognizing that and helping support those students. Next slide, please. I think some schools have can do a lot around mental health services and counseling. Oftentimes they're have integrated mental health services. There's a lot of school districts are going that direction where they have mental health services on site, which is helpful. And then involving the families and the parents and families in that process is important, and getting families involved and being part of the school community is important as well. All right, next slide. All right, one example of that is the newcomer program, and I think Yahya might have been hopefully gotten some support through them. So the newcomer program at our school district, our Oakland Unified School District, is a really wonderful program that helps our new immigrants and new refugees come into the school environment and provides a lot of support. They have a wellness team, they have social workers. It's a really wonderful, so if you get a chance to look at it and get connected to their services, and they really have created a wonderful model, and we work closely with them. So they work closely with healthcare providers too, to make sure that students are getting their vaccines, getting their checkups, so that I often work closely with the school district to make sure that, and if I have, students who are struggling or need some support, I'll reach out to them to help them get support. So again, a wonderful, I think, important to, we break down these silos between medicine and school, and really kind of work together, and our community partners, right? So like all of this we all kind of need to work together and make sure that we're setting up these students to really succeed. Next slide. Okay, so in conclusion, just again, focusing on strength-based trauma-informed approaches really, I think, is important. And I think if we break down these barriers between our different industries and work, and just kind of make sure we're helping set up these students, I think they will hopefully avoid some of the things that we as refugees experience, and help students like Daria and Yaya really succeed. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Noor. I really appreciate you sharing some of your personal experience and your expertise on the clinical impacts of migration on refugees. So thank you so much. See a lot of excitement in the chat for your presentation as well. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And then the next one, thank you. I'm now going to introduce our final speaker, Jasmine Kukan, who's the Refugee Student Wellness Advisor at the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you, Sarah. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us to celebrate World Refugee Day. And thank you to Dr. Noor, Yahya, and Daria for helping us gain a little more insight into the experiences of refugee youth. My name is Jasmine Kukan, and I work with the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health as the Refugee Student Wellness Advisor. My background is in social work and mental health, and I help support our grantees with the work that they're doing in their schools and communities. Next slide, please. Okay, and today I'd like to share with you about the work that we're doing at the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health to address some of the challenges discussed by the other presenters. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the importance of schools for refugee youth and families. We'll go over the purpose of our Ukrainian and Afghan refugee school impact projects, also known as IRC and RC, and we'll highlight some of the work that our grantees and partners have been doing in the community. Next slide. So as many of you may know, in the last 3 years alone, roughly 400,000 Afghan and Ukrainian refugees have come to the US. 50% of Afghan newcomers are children, and roughly 90% of Ukrainian newcomers are women and children. And California has admitted 10% of the nation's refugees. So it's really critical that we continue to build our capacities as service providers in the state and bridge gaps between schools and service providers. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Sadiq mentioned, we do like to think of schools as safety islands. As we all know, schools are an environment for learning, but they're also central hubs within communities where children can play, build social skills. They can learn about the new community that they're in. And I think for refugee students in particular, they're a place where kids can just be kids and take a break from the many stressors that they're experiencing at home. And as we think about connecting refugee youth and families with services, we can't overlook the important role that schools can play. Often, outreaching to families can be a major challenge for service providers, but schools and school staff are people who are interacting with refugee students and families every single day. And so they can help us serve as a bridge for families to get connected with services, restore social and emotional healing, and facilitate integration into the greater community. Next slide. So the challenge that we're faced with, as research shows us, that schools aren't equipped as best as they could be to support refugees and displaced families, even here in California, where 27% of the population are immigrants. Oftentimes, this is because educators have received minimal training about best practices when serving refugee students. They may not fully understand the services that are available within the community. They may not be able to recognize when a student or a family is in need, and they may not know how to navigate linguistic and cultural differences. For families, they may not know that they can reach out to the school for support. And for those who have had limited or negative past experiences with schools or educators, they may not feel invited to participate in the school community. Next slide. Okay, so in order to create programming that's inclusive and ensures family success, a few things need to happen. So first, we need to work to build and enhance the capacity of school staff and CBOs through skills and knowledge sharing, networking and training opportunities. And we need to design and implement innovative practices that are person-centered, trauma-informed, and center access, quality, and equity for students. By doing this, we can ensure that educators are empowered to create welcoming environments, and we can ensure that families have access to the full spectrum of social, educational, and professional opportunities that are available to them, and that they can really be active participants within their communities. Next slide, please. So recognizing this opportunity to enhance schools' capacities to serve refugee youth and their families, the RC and IRC projects have been created to build bridges between local education agencies, also known as LEAs, and community-based organizations to find new ways to support families and make them feel more integrated. Next slide, please. So at the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health, we're doing this through funding for linguistically and culturally responsive support services, through our refugee health support team, who offers skill building opportunities and consultation to CBOs and LEAs, and through our communities of practice advisory group, which is made up of 64 members of LEAs, CBOs, and resettlement agencies. And this is really a space for people to come together, collaborate, and build knowledge and discuss different challenges that are arising in their districts. And Sarah will share the link to that group if any of you are interested in joining and participating in those discussions. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about the activities that are supported through this project with our school and CDO partners. So these include basic needs support, such as connections to housing, food, jobs, and other essential needs in order to relieve some of the stressors that students and families are facing outside of the classroom. Family engagement and empowerment activities, which includes things like language acquisition and empowerment classes to help the extended family build agency and cultural understanding. Youth engagement and development, including academic support, social integration, and psychosocial support, because like Dr. Noor mentioned, refugee students are leaving behind their social support networks, and they have to adapt to a new cultural context, and schools can really play a vital role in supporting them with learning coping strategies and other tools to address their mental health. School enrollment support is another activity, so supporting the hiring of translators and interpreters from the community to increase access to education. And finally, the capacity building for community partners. Next slide. So we really have a unique opportunity to build capacity and networks of support across the state. As you can see here, our school partners are located across the state of California. And once their projects are implemented, we'll be able to impact 6,983 refugee students and families. And once we've selected our CBO grantees, we'll be able to collaborate to serve even more students and their families as well. Next slide. Okay, so I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight some of the incredible projects that our school partners are working on and planning to implement with the support of the RC and IRC projects, just so you can get a feel for what's happening on the ground at schools. And I'll start with Elk Grove Unified School District, which serves Afghan students and families in Sacramento County. So they're working on developing caregiver and child literacy groups, parenting classes, and other in-person opportunities for families and caregivers. In addition to this, they're planning culturally relevant recreational opportunities, such as playing soccer with a Daria Farsi-speaking coach and planning family trips to state parks for families to get familiar with their new environment. And this is for families, and on the provider side, they're offering professional development to staff across the district to better understand and serve Afghan refugees. Next slide, please. Okay, at Grossmont Union High School District in San Diego County, they are planning to provide language support to families to better understand the enrollment process, orientation, graduation, and college requirements. They're also recognizing that many Afghan students and families may require more support to build up their tech skills, so they're creating an orientation to help them navigate using a computer and using things like district sites and applications. And in addition to this, they'll also offer professional learning opportunities for all teachers across the district to better serve Afghan students. Next slide. At Glendale Unified, they're developing a process for all Ukrainian families to be connected with the Welcome Center at the time of enrollment, so they can automatically get connected to things like basic needs such as food, clothing, transportation, and housing referrals. They're also hiring community liaisons who can bridge the communication gap between staff and families. And through a partnership with Glendale Community College, they're working to create positive parenting classes for families as well, and also support students with free tutoring from tutors who speak Russian and Ukrainian. Next slide. And finally, Oakland Unified, as Dr. Noor mentioned, is doing some pretty great work as well. And they're primarily serving Afghan students in the Bay Area. And they're partnering with local organizations to provide Dari and Pashto speaking staff to support with translation at things like conferences, meetings, home visits, enrollment, and all the other things through the school. And they'll also offer ESL and wellness workshops for parents. And in addition to this, they're partnering with Soccer Without Borders to offer weekly soccer trainings and games and academic tutoring and mentorship. So really taking a holistic approach to supporting students. Next slide, please. Okay, so the common theme, I think, across all the examples from the school districts is that programming is really person-centered and trauma-informed, meaning that recognizing that each family's needs, skills, and circumstances may be different. I think they also not only focus on what's happening when students are at school, but also recognizing that student success is influenced by factors outside of the classroom as well. Their services are not only targeting students' academic performance and well-being, but also addressing family needs and training for school staff. And they show us that despite the many challenges that refugee families experience, which I think can sometimes feel too vast to address on an individual level, there are so many opportunities for us to collaborate and partner to foster new solutions. Next slide. Okay, so in closing, I'd like to say a huge thank you to you all, especially our school partners for the incredible work that they're doing. And thank you to Dr. Noor for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to Daria and Yahya for trusting us with your stories and sharing them so beautifully and vulnerably with this group here. And thank you to everyone for taking a bit of time out of your day to learn more about refugee students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for sharing. I really appreciated hearing from you. And thank you to all of our presenters. I, like Jasmine said, really appreciate your time, your expertise, your vulnerability, and for sharing. And I'm hoping that our attendees feel the same way. I'm gathering that based on our Q&A participation and responses. So what we're going to do now is transition. If you could go to the next slide. I'd like to open up the discussion for additional questions that our participants may have for our presenters. So I see that there are some questions already in the Q&A box, so I will look at those and ask those to our presenters, but this is a good time if you have questions that you would like addressed, please go ahead and type those in the Q&A section right now. All right, and I'm going to pull up the first question. All right, this one is for Yahya and Daria. From Megan, what could your teachers and community members have done differently during your first year in the US to better support you? And what supports or opportunities would be valuable to you now that you have been in the US for a few years? And I can put those in the chat as well. If either of you would like to go first and share. And I see, Daria, you sent me your answer, so I can share that verbally for you.
I can go first.
Okay, thank you.
For me, I would like teachers to maybe introduce ourselves before at the beginning of the school year. So our new classmates would be a little aware about our cultural differences and about our language barriers, because it was kind of difficult for me at the beginning to explain everyone about my situation, and some people didn't understand the differences. And also for advisors, I would like to be more aware about classes that are important to take, about credits before getting into college or university, and about the exams that are also need to be taken, because the differences are really big between American requirements and European or any others. Also, it would be really nice, because it would be really nice of people to advise more about places outside of classroom where we can make friends, like clubs or other school opportunities like sports, because I didn't know about any of those until the end of my first year in American school. Yeah, basically that's it.
Thank you, Daria. Yahya, would you like to add anything from your perspective?
Yeah, so I'm gonna give a short answer. So I think for what the teachers should have done was that the teachers give their best support. I remember my teachers helping me a lot, and they give their best support. And something else that could help other students would be, connecting them to many like stuff that there's to do at school, like groups, programs, or something else that schools does, to support the students, which I mentioned in my presentation that I remember one of the wellness workers told me about the program that they were doing, and I joined it and I became a wellness ambassador, and I could help other students from my country. And I think it would be great for teachers to know about more about your culture and know how the problems that we have and we have been through when we first get here, and maybe that would help a lot with the teachers knowing about our cultures, backgrounds, and stuff. And it's great that the teachers also help a lot when they see a newcomer student. I've never had an issue with teachers, not helping me if I needed help. But something else that the district and the teachers could do to help is, to have like more events or stuff that happens that brings parents, newcomer parents and students together so they can meet each other and have like programs and learn about how to use basic technology and how to use apps or other stuff to learn more English and other stuff about the schools. And that's probably it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yahya, for sharing your opinions on that question. I appreciate it. Let's see, we have another question for Dr. Sadiq. Does refugee assistance vary by state? In Maryland, we've had a huge influx of Haitian Creole refugees that have been coming for the past year or two, and most of them apply for refugee cash assistance.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So, for refugees, there are multiple layers of services. The federal, I believe, is the same. It doesn't matter if someone is in Maryland or in New York or California. But then on top of that, there are state and county level services which may vary. So that really is depends on which state and what funding opportunities are available. So. So the answer is yes, because the resources and the laws and everything is different in each state.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq. All right, we have another question. It looks like this one is for you, Jasmine. Have there been any problems with language services for connecting clients to other agencies? They struggle with this in the Midwest and would like to make a change to help all cultures receive services with a language line or an in-person interpreter.
Yes, sorry, Sarah. Do you mind sending it in the chat just so I can look at them?
Yes, I can do that as well.
Okay, I see it now. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think language services is a huge challenge with any environment where we're working with refugees. And I think I know for me in the past, I've used Language Line a lot when working with families. However, it can be a challenge, right? Because things may not get interpreted or translated the way that you want them to, or things might get misconstrued and the meaning that you're trying to convey. So, but oftentimes it's our only option, right? I do think that in-person interpreters would be more effective. It's also just easier to have someone in person with you talking to the family directly. Sorry, just reading the question one more time. But yeah, I think unfortunately it is something that we struggle with in California, across all states, I'm sure. So I guess I don't really have a great answer for that, but we're all struggling together with that one.
Can I add to that, Jasmine, a little?
Yes, please, go ahead.
That we we have a huge influx of Central Americans in the Oakland area, and we've had a lot of indigenous languages, like families who speak a different indigenous language, like mom from Guatemala and some other like indigenous languages that is really, really difficult to get interpreters. One of the doctors I work with has created this wonderful like pipeline where she's training high school students from that culture who speak that language to become interpreters. And so again, building out that workforce. So it's yes, it's not immediate. It's not like it's solving the issue right away, but thinking about in the future is like working with your refugee community, working with your immigrant population to really build for use their help them become those interpreters, help them become those cultural brokers. So I think that it has been wonderful. We've created these like wonderful mom speaking interpreters from the community, who are giving back, and it gives them a job skill too. So I think it's important to think about when you're thinking about language, and that is being creative and really working with your community to help build some of those language barriers.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Noor. That's a really great program. I love that they're doing that. All right. I also saw there was a question about the guide that Daria made, and she said that there's a printed copy of that guide right now, but after the webinar, they can request it from the school and share that out in the post-meeting notes. And there was also a question about the recording being shared, and that will also be shared in the post-meeting notes. All right, and then we have a couple of other questions. Let's see, this could be, are you aware of any resources for newcomer students in other states? So this could be for Dr. Sadiq or any other panelist that has an answer. It says, I'll repeat that again. Are you aware of any resources for newcomer students in other states? Are there any organizations that have a state-by-state list of resources for professors, teachers, students, etc.?
Well, our resources, they are online and they are available, can be used in any state and any county, but they're predominantly focused and available for California. But yes, there are a few resources that are available nationwide. I can name Switchboard, that has supported a project of IRC, International Rescue Committee. But what we will do is maybe put a few resources together and share with all attendees at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq. All right, we have another question. And again, I feel like this could be for any panelist that would like to answer. It says, do you believe that schools in America should implement teaching different languages that students can take from pre-K to 12th grade so that there are higher chances that more students will be bilingual? And I'll put that in the chat for our panelists.
Can I share my answer to that question?
Yes, please.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Do you believe that schools in America should implement teaching different languages that students can take from pre-K to 12th grade so that there are higher chances that more students will be bilingual?
I think that's a great idea because a lot of students, when they come here from other countries, when they want to make friends, when they want to like talk to the teachers and stuff, it's hard for other people to understand their language and understand their background and culture. So I think if there would be like, a program or a class where they teach other languages or cultures about like, other different countries like Ukraine, Afghanistan, or Yemen or any other countries that there are a lot of immigrants from those countries, it'll really help a lot of students in that school and the teachers and the staff to know more about their culture and their language. And if there's a translator, that would probably help a lot because then they can, have their issues solved by the translator if they need to translate anything. Because when I feel like when newcomer students come to the United States, they don't have, they feel nervous to ask questions. Like myself, I felt nervous to ask questions or speak up, and I couldn't speak English, even though when I was getting fluent in English, I couldn't really ask questions because I felt nervous about having a bad English or something. But I think a translator would help a lot. And I remember when I first got here, when I was getting my vaccines checked and stuff, we went to the Children's Hospital in Oakland, and I remember Dr. Zareen helping us a lot with translating. And I'm really happy to help with now that I can speak a little English. I'm really happy to help a lot of students who need translating from my language in my school or in my community. And I think it would be a great idea if we can have a program or a class where they can, teach that about other people's languages and cultures.
Can I add? I agree with Yashia as well. Yeah, and also I wanted to say that I really loved when our teachers were making like special classes when we had a chance to represent each other, because in our classes we also had students from other countries, and it was really nice when we had a chance to talk about our culture, about our cultural backgrounds, traditions, and everyone were sharing their own special things about their culture. That was really nice. And yeah, I think that is really important to give students a chance to talk about themselves. And also, getting back to the first question, it is really appreciative from teachers who already know other students from your own country to share this news with you, and like give a chance to meet those people who are from your country, because you cannot know this when you just come to school, but teachers can do this if they know it. Yeah.
Thank you, Daria. Do any of our other panelists want to address this question before I move on to the next one?
I would just add, the issue of English learners is a big challenge for the state and for the schools, and also for the families as well. There is, a test for it, and the many families and children and students who are learning English as a second language. It's a big challenge for them, because there is a test every year, and before they pass the test, there is a lot of pressure on the students. But all in all, I think providing support for those people who cannot speak English, and especially for the newcomers, which they face not only adapting to the new community, but also the culture, the language, the new environment. That's really a big thing. So that's a law. The subjects and lesson, everything should be in English. But I think the more is the service, the better for the new children.
Thank you, Dr. Sidhu. All right, I'm going to move on to our next question, which is for Jasmine and for Dr. Noor. How have you supported families when students may need mental health services, but also while also understanding the cultural stigma around those services?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Thank you for asking that, Megan. Yeah, I think the topic of mental health is very much stigmatized in our cultures, and it's a definitely really difficult topic to bring up with families. I think, like Dr. Noor mentioned, building trust and rapport with the family is the absolute first step, just so that they can get comfortable with the person they're talking to and feel safe receiving that information. I think oftentimes people don't want to access mental health services because either someone in the community might find out, or they might think that it means that there's something wrong with them or wrong with their kid, but that's really not how we conceptualize mental health in the Western world, I guess. And I think there also needs to be a level of psychoeducation that happens and actually introducing people to the concept of mental health generally, and talking about it in terms that the family or the culture that's accepted by the culture, right? And I think that's where we need to do our own learning and actually consult with people who are from the community and learn from them about how can we talk about this thing in a way that makes people feel comfortable and safe, and not in a way where it's coming off as being accusatory or anything like that. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. And Dr. Noor, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I completely agree with you, Jasmine. I think it's so important to build that trust and also to engage the community. And because, you know, everybody has, we have different ideas of health and well-being and mental health. And so understanding how it's perceived in the culture is very important. And you know, our Western way of thinking about mental health it might not fit for that family and so in that community. So I think it's important to know your community, know how they deal with stress and mental health issues. And really kind of engaging community partners in it. And so, you know, I often work with a lot of community-based organizations that are of the community, and so that they, you know, and work with them to help connect families to resources. And these can be different things. It can, you know, it doesn't have to be like talk therapy, but it can be like, you know, like moms groups or groups that, you know, like these women's groups that where they can sit around and have conversation, talk about certain things and get some education around, you know, mental health issues. So I think that those are important, or community events, or working with mosques or different religious organizations to help provide that support. So I think being creative in getting folks, you know, services and support for their mental health issues, I think is super important. Yeah.
I'm going to add one more thing just as a plug for the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health. This is a topic that we will continue to discuss in our future webinars and presentations, and we'll definitely share that information with you all and invite you hopefully for future webinars and presentations so you can learn a bit more about engaging families into mental health services as well.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Dr. Noor. I have another question for Dr. Sadiq, kind of goes off of what Jasmine was saying about the Center for Immigrant and Refugee Health. I know we had some questions from individuals outside of California. So we're wondering, is CIRH planning to expand outside of California to support refugee youth and their families? And how is the team supporting non-Afghan and Ukrainian refugees?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Absolutely. So the center is for all immigrants, all refugees, regardless of their place of origin. And it doesn't matter which state or county they are living in. That is our plan. That's our goal, to reach out to everyone, and even small, or I mean, in terms of age group, they're children or youth or elderly. But as a nonprofit, we very much operate based on funding, availability of resources. So in California, our footprint is much larger because that's where most of our funding comes. But yeah, for sure, that's the plan, to expand to some other states and places where mostly refugees and immigrants come to.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq.
You're welcome.
All right. And then I have another question, or for Dr. Noor, and I can put it in the chat as well. How can trauma-informed approaches be integrated into mainstream healthcare services to better serve refugee communities?
Dr. Noor, you're on mute.
I said this is a super important question, and I think that it's really crucial for healthcare providers and healthcare services and institutions to have a trauma-informed approach for all patients, not just our immigrant refugee patients. We know that a lot of our patients have dealt with trauma. Our organization, our institution really has tried to make trauma-informed care, those principles, a key part of our healthcare institution. So it's a lot of training that goes into everybody on staff that comes in contact with our patients. And so we think about that. We think about, how, even from like what is out facing, like our media, all these things, like, is it trauma informed? We ask this question, and we do a lot of training for our students as well. I work with our residency program, and that's a key part of our training, is really to make sure that they understand how to provide care in a trauma-informed way, so that we don't re-traumatize our patients and our population. So I think it's important thing to consider.
Thank you so much for that perspective. And Jasmine, I know you've done a lot of work with trauma-informed care in schools. Do you want to add anything about the importance of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's definitely related to some of the points I was talking about in the presentation, where school staff and educators maybe it's changing now, where they are getting more exposure to that training of providing trauma-informed support in schools. But I definitely think training for staff and educators is the best way that we can sort of get everyone on the same page to be mindful of students' experiences and where they're coming from and what they're experiencing outside of the school environment as well.
Thank you. All right, we are getting close to time, so I don't want to keep everyone late, so I'm going to move on, just go to our closing, so that way we have time to wrap up. So if you could start sharing screen again, that would be great. All right, again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to be here with us. And I really want to thank Dialogue for Health for supporting our facilitation of this event. And thank you one last time to our wonderful presenters. Really appreciate your time, your vulnerability, and your expertise is really insightful. And I know I learned a lot and really appreciate everybody. And again, thank you to all of our wonderful participants for your time and participation. Really, truly appreciate all of you celebrating a belated World Refugee Day with us. You will be receiving meeting materials within the next week. And please take note of the exit survey that has been shared in the chat. It will also pop up after you exit the call and will be shared in the debrief email. So we are going to be ending a couple minutes early. So if you could take those few minutes to complete that exit survey, our team would really appreciate your input so we can incorporate your feedback in future events. And thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week.